All right, Jonathan Kay is my guest. I appreciate your time, Jonathan. Thanks for getting into the Jim Fannon Show. And I've been following you. What's up with Tabitha Southey? she got it in for Jonathan Kay or what? I see. Well, not much of a spat, but man, I don't know the woman. I'm friends with her on Facebook. Quote, friends with her on Facebook, but there's so much hate out there, man. With all the issues facing us today, you'd think we'd have better things to fight about.
So I'm going to start with an apology if the audio quality is poor, because I'm never particularly clear in the best of circumstances, but I'm speaking to you from outdoors. In terms of Tabitha Southey, I think that's how her name is pronounced. I've never met her, and I hadn't actually heard of her until she started tweeting fairly vicious things about my mother, who is also a writer and a long-standing columnist with the National Post. And someone said, there's this woman, I think she lives in Toronto, and she's tweeting all this bizarre, vicious stuff about your mother. And and she was formerly a Globe and Mail columnist, I think, which is how I think her name was familiar to me, though I don't think I'd ever read her stuff. And then, her Twitter account was just this kind of like stream of consciousness rant against people she didn't like. And she seemed to have some strange emotional hatred toward me and my mother, and she'd often link us in these weird ways. It's sort of like a elementary school thing where it was like, people would make fun of your mothers or your fathers or like just these weird taunts. And she attracted, in her heyday, which I guess was like a year or two ago, Tabitha attracted this, like, I don't know what to call it. It was like a group of people who just sort of went in for this kind of real, like, gutter trolling on Twitter. And I think the switch to 280 characters on Twitter sort of marginalized them a bit. And I think a lot of them flamed out because some of them, I guess, got suspended because they were just really vicious. And Tabitha herself hasn't tweeted about me in the last few months. Someone told me that her employer had a word with her or something. I have no idea. I don't know the gossip. Like I said, I don't know her. I've never met her.
Unbelievable, the hate that can spew from, and I suffer from it as well. You get to a point where you start asking yourself the question, I don't even know this person. How can I have such strong dislike and such hateful feelings for them? And I mean, we're all prone to it, I think, and social media exasperated it. I just looked at a post of hers is September 12th, where you were talking about a bike accident and a writing that went downhill or something.
Well, someone told me, again, I'm just going to repeat for the third time, I've never met her. But there's all these theories on Twitter and sort of just in Canadian media circles more generally, like what happened to her. Because at one point, my understanding is that she was regarded as, I don't know if she was a first-tier columnist, but she was seen as like a funny, I think she was marketed as a humor columnist. And if you look at her stuff now, some of it kind of purports to be comedy, but it's always like sort of fairly predictable jokes about the same 3 or 4 people, like easy targets like Ezra Levant and Doug Ford. The gossip is that something happened to her, and someone told me that she had some kind of bike accident, which is terrible, by the way. People die from bike accidents and get terribly injured, and if that actually did happen, I feel awful for her. But that apparently since that time she hasn't been the same writer, and that coincided with this strange and unsettling turn on social media that she's exhibited. I don't know the truth of it, but a lot of people have told me that she did have some kind of personal thing. And I've tweeted about this, that you never know quite how to respond in situations like that, because you often do feel sorry for these people. Like some of the most vicious people on social media often are people who have had terrible things happen to them in their personal lives, or they've had downturns in their professional lives. And Tabitha has had 1 or 2 of those, and you feel bad for them. But then they express that misfortune by really acting out on social media, and making pests of themselves or worse. And then you respond to them the way you would respond to any pest. So it's unpleasant all around. And like I said, I think she she hasn't gone after me or my mother the last few months. But yeah, for a while there, it was strange. She actually has only written, I think, 1 or 2 columns in the last 3 or 4 months too. She may be taking a break from writing more generally. I have no idea.
Just not taking a break from social media, obviously. Do you find yourself getting dragged into these, dragged in by these trolls, for lack of a better word, and into Twitter scraps where you find yourself defending yourself or conversing with anon accounts that are just obviously off the rocker?
Less so now.
Okay. Did you have to make
a couple of months, because trolling often seems like sort of a random thing. But I've spoken to enough people who have dealt with it that I realize it's not quite as random as people think. There's often sort of, I mean, it's not formally organized, but there are often like prominent level boss trolls who, they'll go after somebody, and then, the beta trolls will follow, kind of hoping to make a name for themselves. And people kind of go around swarming other people based on the signals they're getting from other trolls, and also based on the sense of vulnerability of their target. So what's interesting is that the people who often get targeted by left-wing trolls are often themselves left-wing, because they're seen as especially vulnerable to this kind of pressure. So if you work at a left-wing activist group, or, you work at Harper's Magazine or Mother Jones or, Rabble or something like that, you're seen as vulnerable because your colleagues are going to expect you to toe a certain ideological party line. And if the trolls can call you out in front of your like-minded colleagues, it's going to make your life difficult. Interestingly, the left often doesn't troll the right, and the right often doesn't troll the left, because they have less power when they cross ideological lines. The most effective trolling takes place within ideological bubbles, with people calling each other out for minor heresies within those bubbles.
And how do you describe yourself ideologically or politically? Where do you fall on the spectrum as far as right-left goes?
Well, I think I'm somebody who nobody wants to claim, because I'm pretty heterodox. And these days, people are known by their heresies. So, if I dared to call myself a conservative, I'd be thrown out of the club immediately, because, I'm pro-choice, and I'm disgusted by Donald Trump. And, on 50 different issues, I'm an abomination to conservative purists. But I think the same is certainly true on the left. And my problem is, as you know, I used to work at a magazine that was like fairly doctrinaire, left-wing publication, and the trolling I received didn't come from the right. As I say, it came from the left, because the not unreasonable expectation was that you have this magazine, it's left-wing, so you should have an editor-in-chief who is extremely doctrinaire on issues like, take your pick, income inequality, cultural appropriation, anything to do with policing language on campus, that sort of thing. And I wasn't doctrinaire. And so I didn't get trolled from the right, I got trolled from the left.
Because you weren't left enough?
I just got kind of randomly trolled on both sides for a few months. Although the last 6 months or so, I don't get trolled by many people. It's actually been sort of a pretty good existence. You kind of just have to show that you're not going to be influenced by it. The people who get trolled are the people who show that they're going to give in to trolling. And so when I get trolled, I usually just ignore them. Sometimes I push back if I think I have something, trenchant or funny to say. But you can't, if you respond to everybody, you'll just attract more trolls, because you're kind of like a slot machine that pays out, right? It's like, let's troll this guy, he's going to respond, and people, if you're someone who has 200 followers and you're trolling somebody who has 20 or 30 or 40,000 followers, it always plays to the advantage of the more obscure person on social media, since they're the one getting signal boosted, right? Not the object of the trolling.
Do you find that the left is kind of eating their own now? Like, I mean, it sounds like they're coming after you because you weren't left enough, and I know you stepped down from that role there, and and I hate to hear or read that someone is self-censoring, but it sounds like that became a frustration for you.
Oh, well, it did. And I mean, to give fair credit to the people who are my critics, like, it is true that the Walrus was, it's the publication where I worked, sort of a hard left publication on pretty much every issue. And here you had this guy, me, who was fairly heterodox, and I think there were a lot of people, and not necessarily people who read the publication, but the sort of people who kind of spend all their time monitoring pronouns and, do you have the right skin color to write this kind of novel? Like, they looked at the Walrus and they say, hey, what's up here? You guys are supposed to toe the line on all these dogmas, and you've got this guy, John Kay, who's saying all these crazy things. Like, according to the rules we now live by, I don't live by them, but a lot of people in the academic and literary and activist communities do. I was very, very much an odd fit for that, and it was only a matter of time till I got frustrated and quit. The people who were hectoring me, they were the ones who were in touch with the world we live in. I was the one who was out of touch. Fortunately, I found a publication that I now work for that they're heterodox themselves, and they don't particularly care what opinions I have on every subject under the sun. So I found a good fit for myself, and the Walrus went its way, and I went mine.
Tell us a little bit about Quillette and the new media out there. I mean, you talked about Trump and I'll say it, he's a bit of a buffoon, and he kind of disgusts all of us all the time. He has taught me a lot of lessons. One, I think I can spot a narcissist much very easily now, where before I was kind of not familiar with it. Also, he's driven a divide between the left and right that's, I think it's happening more and more all over the place, even in Canada. The left and right, it seems like the divide's getting further, wider between the left and right. But also, I think what we fail to realize and acknowledge is that the extremes are the ones with the loudest voice, or a voice now, and I think I heard you talk about this with on your own podcast, the silent majority middle, the 95%, 97% of us that are in the middle, that have overlapping beliefs, that just want to get along, they're too busy to even look at politics, they're silent. Meanwhile, they're turning to both sides, the left and the right, and saying, would you guys shut the hell up? Like, it's really the extremes that are really driving the conversation, it seems, these days.
So I think you're right. And one thing I should say is that the phenomenon you just described is taking place in a microcosm form within every culture and every subculture. And one example I think that's prominent now is the transgender community, where I do think that probably 90 or 95% of transgender people, they just want to go to work and raise kids and sort of do their thing, right. The way people are. But then if you go on social media, Twitter is not representative of humanity, but the activists you see on Twitter in every community, Zionists, anti-Zionists, communists, whatever, they're always going to be the most extreme vocal faction. And so if you went on Twitter and you just looked at the most prominent transgender activists, you would think that the transgender community is a bunch of assholes. Mm-hmm. They're not. They're just, most of them are just like you and me, or anybody. But in the same way that if you looked at the most prominent, Zionists, you think, oh, Zionists are assholes. And if you looked at the most prominent pro-Palestinian rights people, you think, oh, God, they're assholes too. Because those are the people who are most inclined to spend 8 hours a day on Twitter screaming at people. And, I know some transgender people. There's one trans person I work very closely with on a literary project, and these are not people who spend their days on Twitter screaming about pronouns. Right. They have their pronouns, and they might correct you politely if you use the wrong one. But aside from that, they're worried about paying their mortgages. They're worried about how many carbs they're eating all day. Like, they're just worried about the same banal things you and I are interested in. So this plays out within cultures and subcultures all across the board. The other thing about Trump, it is true that Trump has created this really unhealthy situation on the right, where conservatism often has been thrown under the bus in favor of just crass populism. The Republican Party in the United States, obviously, this is happening. But the opposite phenomenon is that when Trump won the election in late 2016, November 2016, it traumatized the left in such a way that the left circled the wagons and created all sorts of purity tests for itself. Because, not unreasonably, leftists said, look, this is, we're in a state of siege. We've got this guy in the White House who's just an open bigot. He's a misogynist. He does all sorts of horrible, horrible things. So we've got to get our act together, and we've got to impose some discipline on our ranks. And I did notice that the election of Trump coincided with the breakdown in social relationship between me and some of my friends who were leftists, who formerly we had gotten along quite well, but suddenly I wasn't left enough for them. And I think within their subculture, it was decided that, unless you believe the following 47 things, you're not going to be an effective foot soldier in the battle against Trumpism. And so I might only believe in 40 or 45 of those 47 things, but it was always the other 1 or 2 or 5 that we were arguing about. And in that environment, it became, you're either with us or against us. And the left mocked George W. Bush when he said a week after 9/11, or maybe it's 10 days, just, you're either with us or against us in the fight against terrorism. That was seen as this really simple-minded Manichean thing to say. But I think tribalism being what it is, whenever people feel under threat on all sides of the spectrum, they say the same thing. And unfortunately, that's kind of been the dominant theme in the conversation on the left over the last 2 years.
Tribalism, I'm glad you touched on that. I want to hit on that as well. But let's get back to, Trump, for me, also has kind of shone a big bright spotlight on media bias. I don't think I was in tune as I am now. Now when I turn on CNN, it's like, come on, MSNBC, even CBC, they do a better job disguising it, I think. But talk to me a little bit about the bias in media. I mean, it seems like you're either one or the other. You're either left or right. And that's what I like about Quillette. They seem to not be jumping into that political fray. They're just having, long-form discussions, essays almost, where you wouldn't read in a normal magazine because of the word content as far as numbers go. But talk to me about your frustration and the media bias that you see out there. So,
media bias. If you look at CBC, as Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, if somebody's outside Canada and doesn't know what the CBC is, the bias comes from the people they recruit. And the people they recruit are they're not bad people. Like the average CBC staffer, junior staffer is probably, they went to Ryerson University, they studied journalism or English or liberal arts of some kind, or they went to York and Concordia in Montreal or something like that. And they tend to be urban, middle class or upper middle class, liberal arts graduates, extremely well versed in social media. They are thoroughly marinated in the political cultures that their friends and former classmates promote on Facebook groups, and Facebook is probably, they don't use Facebook maybe, but any social media, whether it's Reddit or Twitter or whatnot, and they embrace a sort of groupthink, sort of hive mind on most issues. And these are the people who are chase producers and assistant producers on most of the shows, not just on CBC, but probably CTV. They're the recruits who come into the newsrooms of places like the Star and the Globe. And the National Post, even though it's a conservative newspaper, I noticed that some of the younger voices there are swing left. And there's nothing wrong with being a leftist when you're young. Like, everybody should be a leftist when they're 22.
Well, isn't that the saying I heard recently? If you don't vote left when you're young, you have no heart. If you don't vote right when you're grown up, you have no brain.
There's variations on that expression, but broadly speaking, it's true. Like, most people become more conservative when they have a mortgage and they have kids, and
right.
they start worrying about crime in their neighborhood and those kids at the mall and that sort of thing. So my sense is that if you go into a newsroom, the best thing you can do is have a diversity of ages, a diversity of the usual racial, right, gender diversity, all that sort of thing. But it's also just good to have lots of people who are, they live in the suburbs, they have mortgages, they aren't necessarily single kids living in condos in downtown Vancouver or Toronto. And the Canadian media part of the problem is that, like in other countries, there's just this whole swath of middle-tier employees who got laid off because the industry is shrinking. So more and more, there'll be these older white people in their 50s and 60s, and maybe even 70s sometimes, who are just desperately trying to hold on to their jobs and be relevant. And then the whole middle tier has gotten wiped out, and then you've got these armies of 20-somethings who are just, they kind of subscribe to the same liberal left-wing groupthink ideas, which, as I say, is fine when you're that age, but it's not being balanced by anything else. So in editorial meetings, I saw this when I was at the Walrus, is that, I'd be in a room of 10 people. Sometimes I was the only one in that room who had kids, and I was the only one in that room who was paying a mortgage. And so the people I was talking with just had the inherent political attitudes that come with essentially still being in a campus mindset. And all their friends were either writers or activists or members of the literati in some way, and they had political attitudes to match, which is fine, except those aren't the political attitudes of 90% of Canadians. And so when somebody like Doug Ford gets elected, they react with shock because all of their friends think Doug Ford is a buffoon. I mean, I'm not crazy about Doug Ford. Lots of weird attitudes and political views. But when he was elected, I kind of understood why he was elected, whereas I think for a lot of people in the Canadian media, certainly at the CBC, it does not compute, much in the way that blue state intellectuals couldn't figure out the appeal of Donald Trump.
You figure that this is just the political pendulum swinging? I mean, we've had left for so long in Ontario here. I think a lot of people were obviously tired with Wynn's shenanigans, enough to throw them out and give the Conservatives a majority. Down in the States, it's a little different, but do you think it's just a symptom of politics? You have an unaccountable majority government that gets their way on everything, takes us way far to the left and sex ed and all kinds of things, and then people just get tired with it, and then the what am I looking for? The remedy for that is just to vote in a majority government of the other political side.
I think there's two phenomena at play here. One is the completely normal, time-honored phenomenon of after 10 or 15 years, you just throw the bums out.
Right.
Governments get stale. We saw this with Chrétien and Paul Martin. We saw it with Dalton. Well, Dalton McGuinty left, but his Liberal government survived. You see this at all levels of government. You saw it with Mulroney. You saw it with Pierre Trudeau. You saw, I think, with Stephen Harper, Jean Charest in Quebec. Like, it's just after 2 or 3 election cycles, people are like, okay, and that's healthy because I don't know if you're old enough to remember the sponsorship scandal here in Canada. It was like 20 years ago, I guess, when you just have political parties that are entrenched in power for a long time, and they begin to conflate the interests of their party with the interests of the nation as a whole. And that's where the Wynn Liberals were. It was time for them to leave. And for reasons that, even if ideology and policy took that out of the equation, political parties that get too cozy in power, all their brothers-in-law and sisters-in-laws have jobs and agencies, and they have cozy contacts with the media. Like, you have to refresh that. Democracy requires that gets refreshed periodically. The other factor is that Wynn made the strategic decision that she was going to outflank the NDP, which is our left-wing party here in Canada, both provincially and federally, that she was going to outflank them on the left. And so when I was talking to just ordinary people, friends in my neighborhood, parents of my kids' classmates, their big complaint was that their kids would go to school, and increasingly it was all about pronouns and gender fluidity and endless Indigenous land acknowledgements and stuff about residential schools, all of which, like, these subjects they're important subjects, but there was just so much virtue signaling and hard left posturing on these issues that parents of kids in particular found that it was getting ridiculous. And I don't think these are issues that they necessarily feel comfortable talking to pollsters about when people call them for political surveys. But I know it's something that, at least in my neighborhood, which is a left-wing neighborhood. People were just getting increasingly frustrated with it. And they thought that Ontario's government increasingly was focusing on fairly unimportant issues that allowed the government to posture to a sort of hardcore of heavily politicized activists and supporters on social media. And I think Justin Trudeau federally is at risk of going down the same road.
John Kay is my guest. He is the co-host of Wrong Speak. Do you find yourself self-censoring still, Jonathan? And if you're not at all?
So much so that I'm going to cut you off and just say what I think even before you. Yeah, no, look, when I quit my previous job, which is at the Walrus, I guess it was maybe a year and a half ago, I was in a position where, I've been fairly lucky with things, and I didn't necessarily have to work, at least not immediately. But I promised myself that the next job I had, it would be, I would not have to censor a single syllable of my speech, my views. And I said, I'm going to wait until I find the job that allows me to do that. And then I guess about a year later, I started writing for this publication, which I'd never heard of. I mean, it only started in 2015. It's Quillette. And I loved it. I loved writing for it. And I'd written about 3 or 4 articles for it. And then I think I just emailed them and said, do you guys have anyone in Canada? You're based in Australia and you've got a guy in London. And, can I pitch in? And at first it was sort of informal. And I started editing for them and recruiting writers. And it was sort of like I guess you could say an audition on both sides. And I loved the experience. And now I full-time editor there. I've got 3 commissioned book projects going on, and I do Wrong Speak and a few other side projects that I enjoy doing. I'm big into board games, writing a book about board games. It's my passion. But Quillette is really, Quillette helped restore my faith in journalism, because it's not pro-Trump. It's not there's no white nationalism or alt-right bullshit. There's none of that stuff. I have no tolerance for that stuff. It's just classic liberalism. Some people call it conservative. I actually don't care what people call it.
Well, you must be getting alt-right quite a bit.
Well, alt-right has become just this term people throw around to
when they disagree.
Things they don't like.
Yeah, right.
Shortly after I left the Walrus, the Walrus got itself in trouble because they published an article by a really smart guy who I respect. His name is Ira Wells, and he's left of me politically, but he teaches at University of Toronto. Just a super smart guy. Actually lives in my neighborhood. Just nice guy, moderate. And Ira made this one mistake in this article he wrote for Walrus about Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
And I think, I forget exactly the context, but he used the term alt-right to describe Jordan Peterson.
And he stays out of, he goes out of his way not to be political. He's a psychologist, for crying out loud.
Oh, right. When is the last, Jordan Peterson's not, smash the table and say, we have to build a wall and we have to be proud of the white race. You put him and Steve Bannon in a room together, and it's not exactly like they're carbon copies. Anyway, at most journalistic organizations where you have ideological diversity, you would have people in the room who knew the different flavors of classical liberalism or conservatism, and who would look at that article in draft form and say, hey, this is a good article, but that term alt-right, that sticks out like a sore thumb. Just replace it with controversial, classically liberal, pro-enlightenment. There's a dozen other terms you could use. Jordan Peterson is not alt-right. And I'm old enough to remember when there were other terms that were just thrown around in this very clumsy way. It used to be everything was racist, everything was fascist, everything was reactionary. In George W. Bush's times, people talked about the theocons, or they talked about the Vulcans, the warmongering conservatives that George W. Bush was surrounded with. So these terms of abuse they go in and out of fashion, but one way you know they're in fashion is when they just become a sort of generalized synonym for, oh, that's a view I don't like. And,
right.
and that's what happened with alt-right.
How about hate speech?
Well, it's interesting because Canada has a hate speech law. It's Section 319 of our criminal code. And it has been invoked very seldom.
Right.
And the people it has been invoked against are people like Jim Keekstra. There was a guy in Saskatchewan, his name escapes me. They tend to be real hard-boiled hate mongers. And if you read the language of Section 319 of the criminal code, which prohibits hate speech, it's really, really strict about how it defines it. And on top of that, from a procedural point of view, if I remember correctly, it requires the personal intervention of the Attorney General to initiate a prosecution. So that's why there have been David Aheneke was the guy's name,
right.
The Saskatchewan guy. The real hard-boiled hate mongers. I actually don't have that much of a problem with something like that. If the Attorney General himself or herself has to get involved to initiate a prosecution for hate speech, I can put up with that. I'm not so much of a free speech libertarian that I can't live with that. But the problem no longer is top-down censorships or hate speech laws. 10 years ago, Canada went through a phase where people like Ezra Levant and Mark Stein were fighting against human rights tribunals, which were censoring people. And I supported their campaign to some extent because that was the threat to free speech. It was the top-down threat of the government saying you can say this, but you can't say that. It's no longer the threat. The threat now is what I call crowdsourced censorship, where people within professional subcultures essentially crowdsource the censorship of one another through social media. So if you are an academic in a certain sphere, or you're a poet, or you're a novelist in Canada, and Canada is a particularly bad example because it's the entire industry in literature and academia is such a creature of government funding, and it's such a small sandbox in a lot of these fields that there might only be half a dozen people who are able to police the entire subculture through their Twitter accounts. And there's no direct government censorship. It's essentially people censoring one another through social pressure, in the same way that high school students police, what kind of clothes you're allowed to wear by hectoring or teasing or ostracizing people who don't wear the right kind of sneakers. That's essentially what's happening in a lot of these subcultures.
Don't you think it's moved to a point where, I consider hate speech when you say, go out and kill this person type of thing. I'm not sure that, and I can't resolve this words are violence thing that we're falling into now. You misgender somebody, it's hate speech. You talk about sexual differences between men and women, hate speech. You talk about the different personality types that separate left and right on the political spectrum, hate speech. Like, it's just all encompassing now. And like you said earlier, it's almost like if you disagree with me, then you're hateful.
First of all, you'll have to forgive the barking sound in the background. That's my dog. It's not anyone responding negatively to the violence of your words. It's so there was a very influential magazine article that came out. I think it was in 2015, and it subsequently became a book. I think it was maybe this year. I think it was called The Coddling of the American Mind. I may be getting the title wrong, but the thesis was that a lot of what you're describing, which is the idea that the opinions you disagree with are akin to violence, that this is a psychological phenomenon which is rooted in the way we bring up kids today, and also in the way kids are treated on university campuses. University campuses, to a certain extent, have been taken over by marketing and marketing departments and business consultants who essentially treat students as customers and And the experience of going to university is a customer service experience, and the customer is always right. And if a customer comes to you and says, I really feel traumatized because my gender studies teacher showed us this video and there were no trigger warnings, even though pick any of the satirical examples that people have been talking about for the last few years. 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, no one would have taken that seriously, but now they take it seriously because the students are seen as customers. They're not seen as people who are there to be educated. They're seen as people who are there to get value.
Dollar signs.
And and as a result, the administrators respond in the same way the manager at McDonald's responds when you say, you know what, this Big Mac just doesn't taste right. The manager at McDonald's is never going to say to you, oh, well, aren't we picky? Like, the manager at McDonald's is going to say, I'm so sorry, let me get you another one.
Customer's always right.
Sorry, go ahead.
Customer's always right. The
customer's always right, which is great when you go to McDonald's, but if you've got kids who have grown up in that environment, I don't think it's a coincidence that, as other people have pointed out, the schools where political correctness is most out of control tend to be the schools where you've got the most privileged, coddled sets of students. At Yale University, that insane outburst took place, I think it was 2015, where thousands of students became traumatized because a professor had the temerity to send out an email that said, hey, maybe students don't need guidance in what Halloween costumes they wear. They can make up their own minds, and if someone is Scottish and wears a sombrero, it's not the end of the world. And the whole campus went nuts. Or at Evergreen State College out in Washington a year ago, a little more than a year ago, I guess, you actually had one professor, Brett Weinstein, who he had to flee the campus. And this is a leftist. I think he's a biologist. He literally had to flee the campus. You had students actually putting flashlights into cars looking for him because he had the temerity to say, you know what, I'm not going to
participate in a racist movement.
There was this weird day they have there where the white people have to leave campus in solidarity with something. And he said, you know what, this is stupid. I'm a liberal. I support multiculturalism and inclusion and diversity, but I'm not going to leave the campus on the basis of some kind of segregated fad. It's just stupid. I'm not going to do it. And on that basis, they treated him like he was, some kind of war criminal. It was beyond parody. And these are kids. This is Matt Groening's alma mater. This is a very liberal school, and there's a lot of. They're not all pampered kids. I don't want to pretend that everybody on campus is pampered, but the people who have it hardest in our society, the people who make minimum wage, who change diapers, in old age homes, and really have bad jobs and tough lives, they're not the ones who are behind this. The people who are behind this are the people going to $50,000 and $60,000 and $70,000 a year universities. And so I do give some credence to that theory that was in that book. As I said, I think it was the coddling of the American mind.
Well, yeah, actually, Peterson just tweeted out an interview with Jonathan Haidt.
Yeah, he's one of the authors. He's one of the co-authors, and he was one of them.
Lukinoff?
He was the other one. And the one you just mentioned is in charge of FIRE, F-I-R-E, which is an acronym for an organization that monitors free speech on campuses.
Now, we seem to be going down a really strange road, or maybe we've already arrived. The left's influence on campus. You can't, and I'm hardly a conservative. People might try to. Well, I've been called alt-right lately because I'm standing for free speech, and it seems to me that back in the day when I was left, it seemed that the left was the ones that stood for free speech. Now the left is screaming, "You can't speak here." They're trying to block speakers like Peterson, Shapiro, who are Shapiro's obviously a conservative, but this idea that the indoctrination of our learning institutions is just dominated by leftist thinking and professors and whatnot. And if you come out as conservative, you're ostracized immediately, it seems.
this is not an isolated phenomenon. In general, the people who are the most passionate defenders of censorship are the people who believe they are winning or have won the culture war. So if you look at societies where Muslims or religious Christians are very much in the majority or very much ascendant, those are often places where they're going to try and censor or in some cases even imprison heretics. The Inquisition, the historical Inquisition, was run in societies that were almost uniformly Christian. And if you were a Jew or a Muslim and said, you know what, I'm really not big on Jesus, they weren't like, well, okay, that's cool, let's ask someone else in the class what they think. Mm-hmm. They would, they could kill you or exile you. The conservatives did a pretty good job of shutting people up about things like evolution and things like birth control or abolitionism, feminism. Like this, conservatives, when they feel like it, can be monstrous censors. But in the current climate, the conservatives have lost the culture war on a whole range of issues, from gay marriage to bioethics. Like in Canada, it has become borderline hate speech to be pro-life. There are a lot of student societies and student clubs
losing funding
who regard pro-life advocacy as a form of misogynistic hate speech. Now, I myself am pro-choice. I, as on most issues, I'm actually a social liberal. But if you have a religious Muslim or a religious Jew or a religious Christian, or even someone who's not religious but just believes life begins at conception, and they want to form a club on that basis, a university, more power to them. But like I said, they are in the cultural minority, and as in all ages, the people who are winning the culture war, and there's always a culture, whether or not we use the term culture war, every society is always in a state of culture war. It's just the nature of human political organization. They are the people who want to censor, because if you're winning, you want to freeze the scoreboard.
Right.
But, and the best way to freeze the scoreboard is by saying you're not allowed to score any more goals. Mm-hmm. And the way you score goals in culture or politics is by communication and advocacy. Mm-hmm. So if your side's leading 3-2, you want to blow the whistle and say the game's over, right. Which is what people on both sides do. Right now it's the left that's doing it, but plenty of times in history that conservatives do it too.
Fair enough. How do we create a conversation, or how do we enter into a productive conversation if we're always worried about, you can't criticize the religions or, be subject to being subject to hate speech laws or what have you. We've got some serious issues here. The left and right got some serious issues they need to iron out, especially when you consider that the moderate middle is mute. And men and women, it seems to, again, the extremes are on the tail end of the distributions. But there's many conversations that we need to enter into, and if we're worried about our free speech, then how do we get around that? How do we foster a healthy discussion?
I think these things are cyclical, and the usual pattern is that all revolutions eat their own, right?
Right.
The Bolsheviks destroyed the Mensheviks. And then even within the Bolsheviks, the old guard was consumed by the new. In the French Revolution, the period of extremism within the French Revolution was catalyzed because French revolutionaries started killing each other. And some of the survivors, not all of them, but some of the survivors says, hey, look, this is kind of crazy. And that's now happening among the left. I think earlier in the show, you described yourself as a leftist who became disillusioned with some of the tactics and the dogmatism of the modern left. Quillette, where I work, half our writers fall into that category. Many of my writers still describe themselves as leftists. They're just completely disenchanted with some of the political tactics used by the left. And that's more and more and more you see that. Just give you a micro example. This battle that's taking place between transgender activists and so-called TERFs, which that's an acronym that is a term of abuse, which describes feminists who believe, for instance, that that people who are male-bodied should not be allowed to work at rape crisis centers.
Oh, bro.
Or they should not be put amidst the female population in a prison. And so there's this battle, and this is a battle between leftists typically. The so-called trans versus TERF battle is very much a battle within the left, and it's become very shrill to the point that there have been some episodes where there have been like real fistfights, and you have male-bodied people who are beating up women who don't agree with them, and you do have some people on the left who are saying, "Look, this is ridiculous. This has gone too far. We're having fistfights over pronouns." And out of scenes like that, you get people who say, "This has got to stop." So it's not people like me who are sort of observers to all this, who have the moral capital to come in and say, "Hey, you guys, it should be about free speech and due process and the Enlightenment and classical liberals." They don't care what I have to say. What they do care about is if they go to a protest or a rally and they see their friends being physically intimidated because they're not using the right pronouns, that's a problem. And that's when they start to fix the problem, is when it starts to, as I say, the revolution starts to eat itself, and then they get motivated to fix it.
Jonathan Kay is my guest, the former editor-in-chief of The Walrus. He still contributes to the National Post. Jonathan, I got a list here. Newsweek, The New Yorker, Salon, The New Republic, Harper's Magazine, LA Times, The Weekly Standard, The Literary Review of Canada, The National Interest, and The New York Times. Have I missed anything where your publications are getting some pub? Oh, I should say happy birthday also. It was your birthday yesterday, no?
I'm not even sure all of those publications still exist. I should say, in terms of the United States, the publications that I've contributed to most over the last year or so have been Atlantic Magazine, Foreign Affairs, and Foreign Policy. Those are the three publications that I've been contributing to in the United States, because those are the ones that I feel are centrist. I think, I wrote for Harper's once. I don't think Harper's would publish anything of mine these days. It's pretty left wing. Although, interestingly, even the editor of Harper's was taken to task on CBC because he didn't sing from the right songbook on the Me Too movement. The New York Review of Books, a fantastic publication for which I've never written. They were taken to task because they had the gumption to publish something by Ghomeshi. New York Magazine, quite a liberal publication. They were taken to task because Daphne Merkin, who I just interviewed for Quillette, she wrote an article basically taking Woody Allen's side on the question of sexual assault allegations. So, yes, I still do write for a lot of American publications, but the ones I choose to write for tend to be the ones that are still centrist. But as you said earlier, it's a diminishing number of publications, and what I really enjoy most is developing Quillette. A team that I really respect. I have a great boss. We believe in classical liberalism. It is true that there aren't that many publications that adhere to that, but we're one of them. And as I said before, it's helped restore my faith in journalism.
What's your take on the Me Too movement and this latest Gian Ghomeshi sighting with what he had a 3,000-word essay or something? I didn't read it yet.
Yeah, lengthy piece. Look, everyone I talk to says that the Me Too movement was necessary. It was a morally urgent phenomenon, and especially people I know who I'm middle-aged, so I have friends and colleagues who have female children who are already in the workforce. They're already in their late teens or 20s. And the stories they come back with are really bad. Like, women often are mistreated. And, sometimes in really bad ways, but often just in sort of everyday ways that are, sort of the verbal equivalent of ass pinching, right? Mm-hmm. So I do think this movement is necessary. And some of the stories that came out of it, some of the conversations that came out of it were really, really necessary. The fact that Harvey Weinstein was able to do what he did for decades is absolutely disgusting. Mm. The problem is as is often the case, there's very little moral nuance between somebody like Harvey Weinstein and somebody who might have done something 1,000 times less worse.
Well, yeah, I think we saw where, who was it in Hollywood there that, was kind of ranking sins type of thing and saying, a pedophile is not the same as, a lewd comment in the office type of thing. I can't remember who it was, but,
and that person got raked over the coals.
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you get people raked over the coals for making the kind of moral distinctions we make in our everyday life, So, again, this happens to all movements. And sometimes you just see people who are just flat out falsely accused. It's rare, but it does happen. Stephen Galloway at UBC, University of British Columbia, is an example of that. Famous author who was attacked with just completely fictitious allegations of rape.
Steve Paikin?
I'm sorry?
Steve Paikin?
Yeah, Steve Paikin. In his case, the allegation. So Steve Paikin is a prominent broadcaster here in Toronto, and in his case, the allegation was that he propositioned a woman and said that he'd get her on air if she had sex with him. This is a complete. For anybody who knows Steve, I won't get into the details here, but it was just everybody knew it was BS, and. So it's rare, but people do get falsely accused. Ghomeshi is an interesting case because, by his own admission in this article he wrote for New York Review of Books, his behavior really was bad. Like, he acted like a jerk. He was never convicted of a crime, but he'll probably never work again in Canadian journalism. Was the New York Review of Books correct to run this essay by him? It's reasonable for people to debate about it, but I feel very uncomfortable that people will opt for essentially de facto censorship as a form of punishment, because once that becomes the norm, that people who are accused of bad things, even if they haven't been convicted, that they should never be heard from again in society. That's kind of a creepy prospect. A lot of people didn't want Stephen Galloway to say another word in public after he was accused at University of British Columbia, but we now know that the charges against him were completely fictitious. So if that principle had been pursued, a completely innocent guy would have been shut up for the rest of his life. And one of Canada's best novelists, and he did say his piece. He wrote a long piece for the National Post a couple of months ago.
Now, he was silent for a long time after his accusation, though, correct?
For about 2 years, he didn't say a thing on his lawyer's advice.
Imagine living that way under accusations, false accusations, and then having to keep your mouth shut, or choosing to keep your mouth shut for that long. Wow.
And amazingly, there are still people, a very small handful of conspiracy theorists in Canada who still maintain that no, the investigators were all wrong, that Galloway was a rapist, and they still go on social media and say these things. They seem to believe they live in a world where libel laws don't apply. I have a feeling that world may come to a crashing end in not so long.
I'm glad you brought up conspiracy theories. You wrote a book on it, didn't you?
I did.
What's your problem with people that buy into conspiracy theorists? Somebody used to call me a conspiracy theorist for I've been in the hemp business for a long time, and there was it's not a theory, it was a conspiracy against hemp, for crying out loud. That's history. But I mean, you wrote a book on it, and I think you focused on 9/11. Talk to me a little bit about that.
So yeah, the book is dated because it came out in 2011, which is it's only 7 years ago, but that's a long time. I mean, right. We live in the Trump era now, and I described Trump in the book as this crazy guy who was a birther and whatnot, and then now he's president of the United States. So, it's a different world. One thing that has changed is it's harder for conspiracy theorists to back down and not lose face. So when you talk about the people who still believe that Galloway is guilty, I don't know that they actually still believe Galloway is guilty. What is the case, rather, is they spent the last 2 years just tweeting incessantly their certainty that Galloway is guilty. And then we now have this report from a former British Columbia Supreme Court justice, her last name is Boyd, B-O-I-D, saying that Galloway never raped anybody, and it's very embarrassing if you're a novelist or a poet who has spent the last 2 years, or 2.5 years maybe, just tweeting about how this is the crime of the century, and it turns out there was no crime at all. It's humiliating to then go on Twitter and say, you know what, those 875 tweets I did about how Galloway is guilty, turns out I was wrong. Like, that's mortifying. So it's much easier to say, you know what, the whole system is rigged, and everyone's a sexist, and maybe they even believe it. Conspiracy theorists convince themselves of things that simply aren't true.
Mm-hmm. On that same line of thinking, you interviewed Alex Jones, which I think is wildly entertaining and crazy, as batshit crazy. I'm not a huge fan. I don't watch his stuff all the time. I just think, everyone's got the right to his opinion, and he is aggressive. You saw him accosting who was it? The last congressman. He got in his face.
Rubio.
Yeah, Rubio. And Rubio didn't handle it well. And I think Alex Jones is absolutely hilarious. He's a little bit of a pest, and he kind of beats up on people. But how did your interview with Alex go?
So the interview with Alex went, well, it's interesting. It's described in the book. But one thing I'll say about Alex Jones is the big mistake he made from a PR point of view is when he went after the parents of Sandy Hook kids.
Right, that's what everyone always brings up.
As maybe many people will know, there was this horrifying conspiracy theory, completely untrue, of course, that said that the Sandy Hook murders never happened, and that the whole thing was staged, and that the parents of these dead kids were somehow complicit. And to this day, apparently, the parents of these kids sometimes get phone calls,
wow.
Even as they're mourning their children,
Jeez.
People who watched Alex Jones' show and saying, it's all nonsense. So Alex Jones has done some really horrible things. Mm-hmm. None of that had happened at the time I interviewed him.
Okay.
And he was just going off about the Lusitania and
the frogs turning gay.
Like the standards. But what I noted about him, and this is true of many of the most successful conspiracy theorists, they straddle this no man's land between sanity and insanity.
Mm-hmm.
So they're sane enough to write books and have a radio show. They're sane enough to be functional, but they're not quite sane enough to live in the world that you and I inhabit. So another guy who would fall into that category is a guy named David Icke. So this weird, unfortunately he's also an anti-Semite, I think, but he had this crazy conspiracy theory about lizard people, and he'd give, I don't know if he still does it, he'd give lectures where thousands of people would attend. And he inhabited that weird no man's land between sanity and insanity. I think Alex Jones lives there. There was a guy, I think Michael Rupert. He wrote a famous 9/11 conspiracist book called Crossing the Rubicon. I interviewed him in Culver, where was it? In California somewhere. He committed suicide. I was kind of sad a few years after I interviewed him. And he lived in this weird no man's land. That is often where some of the most successful conspiracy theorists live. Because, as I say, they can run Twitter accounts and Facebook groups and write books. They're functional, but their hold on reality is not consistent with what you and I would regard as a 100% sane frame of mind.
I think a lot of that stuff is just an act. It's just like having a stage personality. You know what? I mean, I've done a radio show before. I am not Jim Fannon on that radio show. I'm a radio host. I'm not, I often say this too on social media.
But I'm going to push back on that. The reason I'm going to push back is I agree with you. Like, if you're a radio host, you have to have a big personality for broadcast media. But some of these, the reason I'm pushing back in the case of conspiracy theorists is I've met people like Michael Rupert, or there's a guy named Richard Gage who's a big 9/11 conspiracy theorist. They don't make a lot of money. Like Richard Gage, this guy, I think he still runs a group called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. He travels, I think he still travels around the whole country, speeches about how the fall of the World Trade Center was an inside job. He's not like Alex Jones, where he's got millions of followers. Like he lives out of a suitcase, and for somebody like that, I don't think it's an act, because if it is an act, then what's the payoff, right?
Right.
If you're a radio host, you've at least got. I don't presume to know how much every radio host makes, but usually it's enough to pay a mortgage if it's a full-time job. That's
Barely.
not the case for most conspiracy theories.
Yeah. Jonathan K. is my guest. Jonathan, I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming in. I've kept you way too long, but just on the way out, I don't want to get off the phone. I actually go show a house and I'm trying to make a living. But talk to me a little bit about Deborah So, Wrong Speak, and the new podcast. First of all, I love Deborah So. A powerful woman, beautiful, articulate. On Joe Rogan, I think that was a great spot for her to kind of get some exposure, even though Rogan really didn't let her talk all that much. Would you please tell her?
3-hour show, and I think Deborah said about 45 words.
And I am just so charmed by her voice, if you can believe that. She just got this really sultry voice. Tell me how that's going, and what do you expect that to grow into?
So that podcast is called Wrong Speak. If you use iTunes or Stitcher or any of the 800 programs that people listen to podcasts on, you can download it. We've only done there's 4 episodes we've done in the last couple of months,
right.
But we've got 3 more coming out in the next couple of weeks, including one is a great show with David Frum. One is we're doing it on this turf versus trans thing that we've been talking about.
Right.
And at least one, maybe 2 more episodes. So these are all things we recorded. Deborah is now, she's not just the host of Wrong Speak, she also does a lot of the content production. She is the brains behind the operation. I go on and ask dumb questions and she answers them. As you may know, she's a PhD in neuroscience, and so she's very well placed to address a lot of the issues we talk about that arise in academia, whether it's in the sexual orientation or psychiatric issues. We've had a show on James Namor. We talked about autism, stuff like that. So yeah, she's a great talent, and we're probably going to do Wrong Speak until she outgrows me and goes off and gets her own show in Hollywood or something.
Oh, I think she's great and a strong woman. There's nothing sexier than a strong woman, and she has been able to stand her ground and say hell no to anyone that's come by and say, you know what, you can't say that. I mean, she is trained and holds a degree in that area, and it's nice to see, a woman with that type of knowledge and strength and articulation
Before we sign off, I should say that as a Canadian, the Canadian media landscape is actually, I would say, dominated by the smartest people. Certainly, the ones who are bravest are women. Christy Blatchford at the National Post. I would put, not a lot of people don't like her, but Peggy Wente of the Globe and Mail, who I often disagree with, but she actually, she has the balls to say things that 99% of people wouldn't. My own mother, Barbara Kay, also at the National Post. She's great. The Literary Review of Canada is run by a strong, smart woman. Adrienne Batra, the editor-in-chief of the Toronto Sun. Toronto Sun's a tabloid, and it's not exactly the Times literary supplement, but it's got the fact that anybody is going against the party line on a lot of issues.
Right.
You have to have a lot of backbone to do it, and Adrienne, Barbara, Deborah, Christy, it's a small group of people, and here in Canada, it's mostly women who are doing the heavy lifting, pushing back against political correctness. So we owe them a great vote of thanks. And my own boss, by the way, she's an Australian.
Claire Lehman,
Claire Lehman, super smart, and if it weren't for her, I think I'd just be running my own board game cafe because I've lost faith in journalism. So there you go.
Jonathan K., I appreciate your time. How can people get a hold of you if they want to shoot you a message?
Just come to my house and knock on the door. On Twitter, I'm JONKAY. Or actually, I'm also, if you want to pitch me for Quillette, I'm at john@quillette.com.
Awesome. I'm going to send you a piece in the next couple of months.
Talk about this crazy person we interviewed in the
Brother, I really appreciate your time. Thanks for doing this. We could talk for hours and hours. I know you don't have that kind of time, and I got to run too, but I'm going to look to touch you up in the next few months. Maybe we'll do this again.
Thank you. It was fun.
All right. Awesome. Thanks.
Take care. Bye.
That's John K. Everyone. We had some technical difficulty getting him in today, but we made it, and he had his own mic for the speakerphone, and we had to go Facebook Live, which means I'll come to you later with the YouTube. It looks like we actually are already broadcasting the current version with the good audio with my $17,000 microphone. So nothing more booked. I'm going to chase down a couple more personalities to talk to over the phone. Mayor Jimmy D, heart goes out to you, brother. I hope you get better soon. He was my latest victim to cancel, but obviously he's in treatment for Hodgkin's lymphoma after he got over the pericarditis. I feel your pain. Heart attack, pericarditis, ouch. Recovering from my own little incident there. So Jim Diodati's not going to be able to get in till after the election. He is rerunning for mayor of Niagara Falls, and it's 2:16. I actually have to go show a shack and try and make some dough so we can continue talking to people like Jonathan Kay. He is a freelance writer, the editor of Quillette, which is the brainchild of Claire Lehman out of Australia. He does Wrong Speak with Dr. Deborah So, who I'm totally enchanted with. Beautiful woman and bright as hell. And, man, she's got the strength to stand up to anyone that says, you know what, you can't talk about the differences between men and women. Guess what? We're different. Equal? Wrong. We're not equal. Can't say that, or else you're a misogynist. You're a woman hater. The same thing as if you say, I'm pro-life. Yeah, well, you just hate women then. We can't even have a conversation about it. You know, when is life? When can you abort life? Like Canada, you can abort a life like in 9 months as long as it's in the womb. There's no law against it. I didn't even know that. Anyways, I'm Jim Fannon. Thanks for checking us out. You can follow me at Jim Fannon on Twitter. Obviously, you're on YouTube now if you're watching this. We do have a YouTube channel as well where we put up all the interviews are there. We do rock stars, politicians, and today we did an author and a writer in Jonathan Kay. Have a great day, everyone. Oh, real estate at teamniagara.ca, baby. If you want to sell your house, I got exactly 11 minutes to get to my next appointment. Peace. Say goodnight now. Good night now.